ETFs are one of the most popular yet powerful ways to have your money work for you, and is why investors all over the world have recently been pouring more and more money into them. In fact, the number of ETFs has recently begun to outpace the creation of mutual funds in the US, and currently 40% of investors around the world say they own an ETF, and if you are not one of them, I highly recommend you watch this video all the way through because you are going to gain all the knowledge you need to start building tremendous wealth over time. So with that said, let's start off by going over what exactly is an ETF. Now, an ETF in simple terms can be seen as a collection of different items on a list that you put your money into that allows you to own all of those items within one purchase. So to keep things simple, a real-world example I like to use for beginners to relate to is when you get a receipt from buying groceries. That receipt you get will contain many different items such as chicken for $15, strawberries for $5, orange juice for $2, and whatever other items you buy. And let's just say you ended up getting 20 different items. When it comes time to check out, the price you pay for all those separate items comes down to one total price on your receipt, and let's say that ends up being $100. So why is it that that's the norm to get a receipt of the total bill? It's because you're not going to go and get 20 different receipts for the 20 different items. I've, at least for me, never seen anybody do that. And on top of that, you also don't want to put all your $100 into one specific food like strawberries because you might turn red. But seriously though, no one does that because you're going to want a variety of things to eat and drink from. Now, the amazing part about this is that this same concept applies to ETFs, where instead of going and buying groceries, you're now buying stocks. With an ETF, you get a list of different stocks, all of different sizes, where they're bundled into one price. And by investing into an ETF, you can buy many stocks, for example, let's say 100 companies, and you can do that instead of having to buy each one separately, making it much more convenient to just get an ETF. On top of that, I also mentioned a terrible joke about putting $100 into strawberries turning you red because, yes, it was a bad joke, but the meaning behind it is valuable because you're not going to put all your money into one specific stock. That's just too much risk. And with too much risk, if things don't go the right way, you could get angry and also turn red. But besides that, with ETFs, your goal is to improve diversification by being exposed to many different companies where you want to maximize your returns, yet minimize the risk of losing money. Going forward from there are two main types of ETFs that you need to know about, and they are actively managed and passively managed ETFs. Actively managed ETFs explain itself because they are ones where the investments inside of the fund are controlled by a person that is called a portfolio manager. Think of this like a professional chef in a restaurant who is constantly adjusting the menu to try and get the best reviews and overall results. Which this is a big reason why actively managed funds have a higher expense ratio, meaning it is more expensive to own actively managed ETFs. And because of that, most of this video is going to be covering my favorite, which are passively managed ETFs, also known as index-based ETFs. These ETFs are not controlled by a human, but are set to track a particular market segment. That market segment is referred to as an index, and one of the most popular ones is the S&P 500 index that is set to track the top 500 publicly traded companies that are listed here on the US stock exchanges and basically resembles a broad scope of the US economy. And since the S&P 500 is a collection of 500 different companies, instead of wasting your time buying each one separately, you can now buy them all at once through an ETF, and on Vanguard, that would be called the Vanguard 500 Index Fund ETF that has a ticker symbol of VOO. By doing this, you automatically get exposure to companies like Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, and many more you probably heard of. And another nice thing about these index-based ETFs is that you can invest into many different types of markets. So say you wanted to invest into companies that are outside of the United States, you can do so by getting an international fund, which on Vanguard could be the Vanguard Total International Stock Index Fund ETF, ticker VXUS. Or let's say when it comes to the S&P 500, you want more exposure to the total US stock market, you can actually do that on Vanguard by getting the Vanguard Total Stock Market Index Fund ETF VTI. Now, I'll be covering the best index ETFs later on in this video, but something you first need to understand that can be confusing if you're new is understanding the difference between ETFs and mutual funds. As I mentioned earlier, there is a Vanguard S&P 500 ETF that tracks the S&P 500 index and has a ticker symbol of VOO. Now, because this is an ETF, you can purchase this on pretty much any platform that you want, such as Fidelity, SoFi, M1 Finance, and many more. But if you look closely on the Vanguard S&P 500 ETF page, right in the middle you can see the company states they also have an available S&P 500 mutual fund. If you click on that link, it will take you directly to Vanguard's S&P 500 index-based mutual fund, and as you can see, this option is 5 ticker symbols that make it VFIAX instead of 3 symbols for their ETF version VOO. Now typically mutual funds have 5 letters in their ticker symbol, where ETFs are normally 3 or 4. But a difference here with the two is that if you are wanting to get their 5-letter ticker symbol mutual fund, you need to be on Vanguard's platform unless you want to pay an extremely high fee on somewhere else like Fidelity, which you should never do. As you can see, if you try to purchase VFIAX on Fidelity, you will be charged a fee which isn't small. Where if you wanted the ETF VOO on Fidelity, you don't have any fees. Another difference between Vanguard's mutual funds and ETFs is that if you are on the Vanguard platform, you need a $3,000 minimum amount to get their Vanguard mutual funds, where there's pretty much no rules for ETFs on nearly every platform. And when it comes to getting those mutual funds, when you want to buy or sell them, the trades are not going to go through until the end of the market day. This can be a big turnoff for many people, where if you were to get ETFs, they trade similar to stocks, so you can buy or sell them throughout the day at any point, making it very easy to change your positions in your entire portfolio. But a huge factor on why ETFs are actually outpacing mutual funds now is because they are more tax efficient, where you have more control over your taxes. Invesco explains this in simple terms by stating with ETFs, capital gains and taxes are generally recognized only when investors sell their own shares, where with mutual funds, you may have taxes triggered without even selling the actual fund. With that said, let's now go over the advantages to index-based ETFs, with the first being that they are passively managed. Over the last 2 decades, a staggering 92.19% of large cap actively managed funds fell short of the S&P 500 revealed by the S&P Dow Jones indices. Even the famously known legendary investor Warren Buffett clinched a $2.2 million victory, affirming that a passive investment in the S&P 500 index fund would outbeat actively managed portfolios over a decade. The next advantage of index-based ETFs is diversification. Consider this. You decide to invest into 2 stocks, putting $5,000 into each, with a total amount on your portfolio being $10,000. If one of the companies were to go bankrupt, that means your portfolio is going to dive down to $5,000. However, had you invested the same amount in the S&P 500 index fund and one of its 500 companies went bankrupt, your investment would only dip to $9,980. And from that, a famous quote that I love, which ironically is from the founder of Vanguard, Jack Bogle, is when he says, "Don't look for the needle in the haystack, just buy the haystack," aka index funds over specific stocks. Something I personally learned from my first few years of investing is that it is extremely difficult to pick the right stocks, and even when you pick the right ones, you will eventually have some sort of regrets. So because I don't want you to have to go through this cycle of never seeing true compounding growth on your investments, I truly believe that strategizing a plan where your portfolio consists of mostly index funds motivates you to stay on track and to continue adding instead of trying to sell your positions or change them often. Which in the end, by investing into many different types of index funds, historically they have achieved great results, allowing investors to build great wealth over time. If you're interested to see a portfolio similar to mine, stay tuned toward the end of the video, and if you want to see my exact portfolio, check out my private newsletter. I'll have linked in the description below. So anyways, besides diversification, ETFs are also great because of their low fees. Index funds are great when it comes to their expense ratio, which is the total cost it takes to own the fund per year. So if we look at the Vanguard 500 Index ETF ticker VOO, that comes at a 0.03% annual expense ratio, which compared to an average actively managed fund that is between 0.5% to 1% has a big impact over time. Picture this. If you had $10,000 invested in the S&P 500 index fund I just showed you, VOO, your expense would be a whopping $3 per year, which is the price of a burrito at Taco Bell. Now, say an actively managed ETF like ARK at 0.75% of an expense ratio, that means it would cost you $75 per year, which may not sound too significant, but over time has a major impact. Let's just say you had $10,000 in that S&P 500 ETF VOO and add $3,000 to it every year for 30 years and end up getting an average 8% return rate. The total cost from fees in that ETF would be roughly $2.7 thousand, but with a fund like ARK at 0.75% 0.1% of an expense ratio, you'd be looking at a staggering $62,000 from fees. That's an extra $60,000 from fees, so you better hope that fund outperforms. Which in the past 5 years, ARK hasn't even been close to that. So before moving on, if you're finding any value in this content, I'd really appreciate you hitting the like button on this video and subscribing to my channel for future content like this that I personally believe is worth watching. With that said, let's now go over Vanguard's ETFs compared to its competitors. Now, Vanguard has a ton of history when it comes to index funds, as the founder of Vanguard, Jack Bogle, helped create the first index mutual fund in 1976, which since 2010, they famously created their S&P 500 ETF, VOO. Besides that, something I love about Vanguard's ETFs is that you can basically create an entire portfolio using theirs. For starters, of the 3 main old school brokerage firms, Fidelity has 84 ETFs traded on the US market, where Fidelity has 64 and Charles Schwab with 30. And just a side fact, Invesco has 219 ETFs and BlackRock has 427, but personally all around, Vanguard's are currently my favorite. But now I just want to briefly compare the difference between Vanguard's S&P 500 ETF to its competitors. So if we look at VOO, it has an expense ratio of 0.03% a year, and then with this fund, over the past 10 years, it has averaged roughly 12% of an annual return, which is very good. Then another alternative to purchase the S&P 500 index is SPY, which is through the Standard & Poor's company, where theirs has roughly a 0.1% expense ratio, and over the past 10 years has averaged roughly 11.9% per year. So that one's obviously a bit more expensive and the returns are slightly lower, which makes sense, but they're also very similar in returns because they're tracking the same index. We then have an iShares S&P 500 ETF, ticker IVV, that has an expense ratio of 3% and an annual return over the past 10 years of roughly 12%, just like Vanguard's. If you want to see a deeper scope of the main types of funds you can get and how they compare, I highly recommend you check out my free investing 101 guide I have linked in the description of this video. Now with ETFs, you can pretty much buy them on any platform, as I mentioned earlier, so on my Fidelity account, I actually use Vanguard's ETFs. It really doesn't matter how you mix your ETFs because you could have many different ones in one specific account. For example, you could have Charles Schwab's SCHD, which is a king when it comes to investing in dividends, the Vanguard VOO for S&P 500 exposure, and say you wanted international stock, you could get the iShares International ETF IXUS by BlackRock, which, like I said, Vanguard has many good options, so if you didn't want the iShares International Fund, you could get their Vanguard International Fund VXUS, which is actually the one I have. So remember that all these funds are going to get relatively the same results because they track the same indexes, but if you are going to get an actively managed one, you need to be aware that these results are going to vary much more. So because of that, if you are going to get an actively managed ETF, I highly recommend you dig into more research and understand where exactly it is that you're placing your money and what type of fees are taking place. An example of this is an ETF like ARK that is managed by Kathy Wood that has a 0.75% expense ratio, and you can see in the fund objective that it is an actively managed ETF that seeks long-term growth by investing into domestic and foreign securities that relate to their theme of disruptive innovation. These ETFs may perform very well, but they could also do terrible compared to a simple index fund. So when it comes to ETFs, yes, it can be a personal preference, but for me, I own mostly Vanguard's ETFs, and I'm about to show you some of the best ones that you should know about. The first ETFs I'm going to mention are domestic funds because they consist of stocks that are solely in one country, that is the US. The first being BTI, that tracks the CRSP Total US Stock Market Index that contains large, mid, and small cap stocks. This fund has a 0.03% expense ratio, has seen roughly 11.5% of an average annual return over the past 10 years, with its top holdings being roughly 6% of Apple stock, then 5.5% Microsoft, 2.8% Amazon, and so on. Now, all the funds I'm showing you are called market cap weighted funds because the stocks that are inside of the fund are given weight based on their size. So because Apple is the largest company in that fund, it carries the most weight towards that fund's performance. Now, because this is a total stock market ETF, it contains small, mid, and large cap stocks. Another alternative you could do if you want to get more control on the types of markets you're in is get a small, mid, and large cap fund all separately. For small cap stocks, you could invest into VB, which tracks a small cap index and comes at a 0.05% expense ratio, has seen an average annual return of 8.44% annually over the past 10 years, with its top holdings being ones that you probably haven't heard of. From there, you could you get VO, which tracks the CRSP US Mid Cap Index and comes at a 0.04% expense ratio, has seen an average annual return of 9.42% annually over the past 10 years, with its top holdings being companies that you've also probably never heard of. So that leaves us with large cap stocks left, and that is going to be through the S&P 500, and on Vanguard that is VOO. This fund is considered a gauge for the overall US stock market that comes at an expense of 0.03%, has seen an average annual return of 12% over the past 10 years, and has its top holdings starting with Apple at 7%, then Microsoft, Amazon, Nvidia, and so on. Notice how I mentioned that you could do these 3 ETFs or VTI, which is the total market fund, and I say that because of what's called fund overlap. To clarify, 99% of the holdings in VOO, the S&P 500, are also in VTI, the total stock market ETF. And that then comes out to be 86% overlap by weight, so make sure you check this out before making your portfolio. I'll leave a link in the description below for you. It's completely free. Moving on from there, another Vanguard ETF that has historically achieved great results so far is VGT, Vanguard's Infotech ETF. Now this ETF tracks the performance of stocks in the information technology sector, and that comes at a 0.1% expense ratio and has achieved close to an average annual return of 20% over the past 10 years. That's just insane. And a huge reason for this is its heavy weight concentrated to companies like Apple and Microsoft being 21 and 17% each, totaling 38% of the entire fund. Just be aware of this because if you owned only this and put all your money into this specific fund, that means 38% of your money is in 2 stocks, which is a lot. Another option after that is VYM, which is a high dividend yielding ETF that has an expense ratio of 0.06%, with its dividend yield being 3.07% and an average annual return over the past 10 years of 9.38%. And another option when it comes to international exposure, which I've mentioned, is the Vanguard Total International Stock ETF VXUS, which is a solid option coming at 0.07% of an expense ratio, consisting of 40% of its weight from Europe, 27% from the Pacific, 25% from emerging markets, and over the past 10 years, it has averaged an annual 4.06%. Now, you may be saying that's not the best, but having international exposure is a great way to improve diversification for your entire portfolio. If you're asking why, if the US market were to completely tank, you at least have another area of your portfolio that might not have done poorly, and honestly, it could have actually gone up. And then the last one I want to mention is a bond ETF that is Vanguard's Total Bond ETF, ticker BND, which has a 0.03% expense ratio, currently yields 4.31%, which is higher than normal right now due to current market conditions, and over the past 10 years, it has averaged 1.77%. And a fun fact to know is that with bond ETFs, you are going to be paid out that interest monthly. All right, so that was a ton of information. Let's now move on to talking about how you can actually trade Vanguard's ETFs, which if you've ever bought a stock before, they trade the exact same way, so the concept applies exactly the same way. Now, I don't have a Vanguard account, you don't need one, so I'm going to be showing you this example through SoFi, and typically on the top of your platform, you're going to see a search bar. You're going to have to click on that and type in the ticker of the fund. You could also do the name of the fund, but for this case, type in VOO, and then when I click on it, it takes me to a page that shows a buy button for this type of fund. From there, if you click on that buy button, you'll be able to type in the amount you want in dollars, or you could do shares if you'd rather, but it doesn't matter. After that, you really just need to review the order and click submit. And if you wanted to sell, I know this sounds simple, but it's pretty much just the exact same thing in reverse. You're going to click on that fund on your account, and you're going to hit the sell button, type in exactly how much you want to sell. It might even say sell all in one click, and then you can get rid of all that fund or whatever you want. So to lead off from that, let's now go over how you can build a portfolio. Before buying any investments, you first need to create a plan. So I would recommend applying the 110 rule to at least get started. This is a guideline because you're going to be taking 110, subtracting it by your age, and that's going to allow you to have a percentage of stocks compared to bonds that you should own. For example, let's say that you are 30. That means that this rule suggests you invest 110 minus 30, which is 80. So 80% into stocks, and then 20% into bonds. This is a great approach because it provides a safety net for those that are nearing their ideal retirement age, and also allows for those that are younger to invest in more risky, longer-term investments for growth. Now, I'm going to be completely transparent and give you a brief breakdown of how exactly I allocate my investments, starting with these 3 categories: domestic, international, and bonds. So with those categories, I then create a percentage that I want ideally toward each one for my age and understanding my own position, which I would consider I am an aggressive investor, and that is because I have roughly 75% domestic, 20% international, and 5% bonds, since I don't necessarily need much in bonds right now. For the domestic, roughly 50% is in a combination of VB, VO, and VOO, which, to keep things simpler, we could say VTI, the total stock market ETF. I also have another 10% in VGT, the Vanguard Info Tech ETF, that is a high growth fund. And then a personal preference, but this is to gain exposure in other areas that I don't have much weight in yet, I would add 5% into the Vanguard Materials ETF, ticker VAW, that includes stocks of companies that extract or process raw materials. I then have roughly another 5% in Vanguard's Consumer Discretionary ETF, VCR, that seeks to track the performance of companies that manufacture products and provide services that consumers purchase on a discretionary basis, which consist of companies like Amazon, Tesla, and Home Depot. To complete the 75% domestic, I then have roughly 5% in stocks. Please realize this is not financial advice. I really just want you to get a better feeling for what I have. If you want to see my exact ones, you can check out my private newsletter, but do not make any financial decisions because of me. You must do your own research. After that, for the 20% international exposure, I use the Vanguard Total International Stock ETF, ticker VXUS, for all of that. And then for bonds, either to use the Vanguard Total Bond Market ETF BND, money market funds like SPACs on Fidelity, or Treasury bills, for example. If you're looking for a more moderate approach, I would recommend adding more foreign or bond funds and reducing the overall domestic because of how high that is weighted, especially when it comes to investments that are high risk, high growth, like VGT. So like I said, if you want to see my entire portfolio and how I allocate each of my own investments, check out my private newsletter I have linked below. And if you're curious to learn more about other portfolios that you could create with Vanguard's ETFs, I highly recommend you check out the videos I've created on that I'll also have linked in the description. I hope you found value in this content. If you are lost, confused, or have any questions at all, let me know in the comment section below and I'll do my best to help you out. And as always, don't forget to hit the like, subscribe, and notifications button for future Money Talk content like this.